Trade deficits are one half of a double entry accounting system. Without the other half, we don't really know very much. For example, I have a huge trade deficit myself with Amazon, Best Buy, Duke Energy, Verizon Wireless, Honda, and Kroger stores. And you probably have big trade deficits with all of the places where you shop regularly. Real gross output increased at an annualized rate of 3.2%, far better than GDP. Certainly not a recession, hardly an emergency. There is no economic emergency. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Thank you for joining me. My name is Mark Shupe, and this is the Moneyball Method Podcast. As you may recall from last week's presentation, we discussed price discovery, particularly with regard to pricing power, pricing flexibility, McDonald's Corporation, and the individual consumer and their personal choices. Today, I want to talk about the price mechanism again, but this time in terms of tariffs, particularly in the context of the recent Supreme Court decision that struck down the tariff rampage of President Trump and the rationale for that decision. The title of today's presentation is Tariffs, Deficits, and the Supremes. And since we're talking about economics today, I'd like to begin with a very brief definition of economic science. This is important. This is essential. These are the foundational principles of the Moneyball Method. To begin, production creates wealth. Wealth creates supply. Supply creates demand. Prices are information. Markets reward success. Profits attract capital. Capital finds talent. Talent obeys reality, and money is the legacy of reasoned effort. So with that foundation, with regard to economics, let's talk about a very concise economic concept, and that is international trade deficits. What are they? How do they work? Where do they come from? And I'm going to give a very brief explanation what trade deficits are. First of all, we have to define trade. Trade is voluntary exchange for mutual profit. Trade deficits are one half of a double entry accounting system. Without the other half, we don't really know very much. For example, I have a huge trade deficit myself with Amazon, Best Buy, Duke Energy, Verizon Wireless, Honda, and Kroger stores. And you probably have big trade deficits with all of the places where you shop regularly. Number three, regarding trade deficits, cheap imports into America, or into any country for that matter, mean job creation. People have more money to spend. They can buy other consumer goods with the money they save from the cheap imports. This also allows for increased savings and investments in future prosperity. It enhances capital formation. Number four, countries that subsidize their exports, subsidize their home industries, are actually exporting wealth to the customers that are importing their goods. And lastly, trade deficits happen when there are income disparities between countries. If America has a trade deficit, it's because Americans earn more. They have more wealth and prosperity with which to spend on consumer goods, as well as businesses buying raw materials and for value-added products and services. That's trade deficits in a nutshell. But what about protective tariffs? What are they? How do they work? Where do they come from? First of all, tariffs are the intrusion of force by the state in private transactions. Keep that in mind. It is force. Government fundamentally is force. Number two, tariffs degrade the price mechanism. Obviously, we know that they have the capacity for increasing prices, perhaps substantially. But the price mechanism is the foundation for efficient markets. Remember my 30-second economic science explanation at the beginning of this podcast. Tariffs delay the innovation needed for declining industries to stay competitive. In addition, tariffs impede the free flow of capital. Capital formation is the foundation of peace and prosperity for any society. And lastly, tariffs are taxes. They are taxes on importers as well as consumers. They do not necessarily punish the countries that they are intended to punish, which really isn't a good idea in the first place because it is the force of government intruding on private transactions that everyone engages in for mutual profit. But let's talk now about the Supreme Court decision regarding the Trump administration's across the board arbitrary and always fluid tariff policy. What I'm going to quote now is a press release from earlier this week from the Pacific Legal Foundation. The Pacific Legal Foundation is the organization that brought the case that was heard by the Supreme Court and adjudicated this week. Number one, the Supreme Court's decision is a win for the separation of powers and the American people, said Oliver Dunford, a senior attorney with Pacific Legal Foundation. Secondly, from this press release, the lawsuit is titled Learning Resources versus Donald J. Trump. In Learning Resources versus Donald J. Trump, in which the PLF, Pacific Legal Foundation, submitted a friend of the court brief, several corporations, among others, sued the president for unlawfully interpreting a congressional statute to impose tariffs on nearly every nation worldwide. Thirdly, the court held that the power to regulate does not include the power to tax. Remember, tariffs are a tax on importers and consumers, not the foreign country. And Congress did not delegate away its power, its taxing power in the IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act that the Trump administration invoked to rationalize their arbitrary, across-the-board, ever-fluid tariffs. Lastly, the 6-3 decision held that in enacting IEEPA, Congress did not delegate the distinct and extraordinary power to impose tariffs, a power that the Constitution vested in Congress. So now we have trade deficits, we have tariffs, we have the Supreme Court decision, but what is the IEEPA? I think that deserves a little bit of explanation. And for that, I turn to the fine folks at Reason.com magazine. In explaining the IEEPA, Reason magazine says, if the president declares a national emergency with respect to any unusual or extraordinary threat, that is part of the legislation, which has its source in whole or substantial part outside the United States, foreign governments, to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States. The president may regulate, direct, compel, nullify, void, prevent, or prohibit any acquisition, transportation, importation, or exportation of any property in which any foreign country or national thereof has any interest. That is, in a nutshell, the IEEPA. It does not allow for the president, the executive branch of government, to impose tariffs. But President Trump imposed these tariffs, citing an economic emergency, a national emergency. So let's find out, what is that national emergency? Does it exist? Is it real? Should we take it seriously? According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, that's the federal government, U.S. goods and services trade deficit for 2025 was $901 billion, a marginal 0.2% decrease from 2024, despite new tariffs, the third largest in history. In other words, according to the BEA, the tariffs had zero impact, almost, on the trade deficits. Secondly, also from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, for the full year 2025, the U.S. economy grew at 2.2%. That's GDP. A deceleration of 2.8% from 2024. 2.2% growth is not a recession. It is certainly not an economic emergency. Thirdly, and also from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, by the third quarter of 2025, real gross output, again, this is gross output, not GDP. Gross output is the metric that I prefer, that I believe tells the true story, or at least a certain better story regarding the economic vitality in the United States of America. Real gross output increased at an annualized rate of 3.2%, far better than GDP. Certainly not a recession, hardly an emergency. There is no economic emergency. Fourthly, wages increased 0.3% in January. That was last month. Unemployment was unchanged at 4.3%. Just using those employment numbers, that is not an economic emergency. It may not be rapid growth, but it's certainly not unhealthy. But forget about the employment data, forget about GDP. What are the forward-looking metric that we might want to turn to instead of these historical backward-looking metrics? One of the best ones, and one of the most commonly used ones that is worth looking at, certainly like anything else in context, is the U.S. stock market. It is a leading indicator. The S&P 500, as you recall from a previous podcast about 3 weeks ago, grew 17% in 2025. Hit new highs again this year, by the way. So what is the economic emergency? There isn't one. I'm going to turn back to Reason Magazine and their comment about the tariff and its effect on the trade deficits. According to Reason Magazine, in an article dated February 19th, 3 days ago by my calendar, America imported $3.44 trillion of goods in 2025, according to the census report. That's a $143 billion increase over 2024. Now, that's a discrepancy from the previous data that I mentioned, but Reason Magazine is measuring only one aspect of imports versus exports. A $143 billion increase in imports of goods, despite the higher taxes applied to many of those imports last year. Meanwhile, exports increased by $123 billion to a total of $2.2 trillion. Imports increased regardless of the tariffs. Exports increased regardless of the tariffs, meaning the economy is vibrant, the economy is healthy, at least based on this data. Also from Reason Magazine, that leaves a trade deficit of $1.24 trillion for the year, a 2.1% increase over 2024, the largest total ever reported. The tariffs are having no impact. They're probably having an impact. We can't see it, but it's not reflected in these numbers. Supreme Court decision, and this is also from Reason Magazine in another article dated the next day, February 20th, and I quote, "Americans fought the revolution in no small part because they believed that only their elected representatives, not the king, not even parliament, possessed authority to tax them," Justice Neil Gorsuch pointed out. And Americans later codified these beliefs in the Constitution. It is clear, however, that Justice Thomas, Justice Alito, and Justice Kavanaugh were willing to let Trump get away with the same kind of executive overreach that they previously refused to let Biden get away with. That had to do with the forgiveness of student loans. In conclusion, what are we to think and do as Moneyball investors, as objective investors, as value-driven investors? Now, I want to leave you with this thought. It is up to us to defend the virtues of money, the information of prices, the elegance of markets, and the justice of earned profit. Thank you for tuning in today, and I hope you will join me again next week.